No one remembered the boy who stood barefoot at the edge of the broken sidewalk, his clothes thin, his hands shaking as he made a promise no one believed. He was the kind of child people looked past, the kind the world decided early was destined for nothing. When he said he would come back one day and repay a kindness, the laughter that followed echoed louder than his voice. Promises from boys like him were never taken seriously. They were dismissed as dreams too fragile to survive hunger, prejudice, and time. But 20 years later, a black luxury car stopped in front of the same forgotten street. And when a man stepped out, carrying the weight of success and memory, the truth behind that long-ignored promise finally demanded to be seen. If stories like this move you, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Black Voice Story for powerful stories that matter. The neighborhood had always been invisible to the rest of the city. It sat just beyond the places people cared to invest in, tucked behind rusted factories and abandoned warehouses that smelled of oil and dust. Streets cracked under decades of neglect, and the streetlights flickered like tired eyes that had seen too much and been fixed too little. This was where the poor lived, and more specifically, where black families were pushed when the city ran out of sympathy. The boy grew up there, in a narrow apartment where the walls carried the sounds of neighbors through thin plaster, and the floor creaked under every careful step. His mother worked long shifts cleaning offices downtown, returning home with aching hands and a quiet determination that never quite hid the exhaustion in her eyes. His father had disappeared early, swallowed by a system that rarely returned black men whole, if at all. From a young age, the boy learned how hunger felt when it stayed too long. He learned how teachers spoke slower to him, as if poverty dulled intelligence. He learned how store owners watched him more closely than other children, how security guards followed his small movements, how strangers crossed the street when he walked toward them. None of it was ever explained to him, but all of it was absorbed. Despite this, he carried something dangerous inside him, belief, not the kind born from comfort or encouragement, but the stubborn belief that life could be more than what he saw. He clung to it quietly, the way one holds onto warmth during a cold night, afraid it might disappear if exposed. One winter afternoon, hunger pushed him further than pride ever allowed. He had not eaten since the previous morning, and his mother would not return until late. Snow lined the edges of the street, gray and heavy. As he walked past shops he had no reason to enter. His steps slowed near a small repair store, its sign faded but its windows glowing with warmth. Inside worked an older man, warm but steady, someone who had built his life piece by piece rather than inherited it. He noticed the boy standing outside longer than necessary, noticed the way his eyes fixed not on the products but on the warmth behind the glass. When the boy finally stepped inside, his voice barely rose above a whisper as he asked for help. The man saw more than hunger. He saw familiarity. He saw himself decades earlier, standing in the same uncertainty, learning how easily the world dismissed those who looked like him. Without asking for anything in return, he offered the boy food, warmth, and a moment of dignity that felt rare. The boy ate slowly, aware of how fragile this kindness felt. As if sudden movements might break it, gratitude filled him with something close to pain. Before leaving, he made a promise that sounded impossible even to his own ears. He said that one day, when he was rich, he would return and repay this kindness. He did not specify how or when. He only said he would. The man smiled, not because he believed the promise, but because he believed in the necessity of hope. He had learned long ago that survival required small lies one told oneself about the future. When the boy left, the door closed softly behind him, and the moment faded into memory. Time moved forward as it always did, uncaring and relentless. The boy grew older in a system that constantly reminded him of his place. Schools underfunded, opportunities limited, expectations low. Teachers suggested trades instead of dreams. Counselors spoke of realism, a word that often disguised surrender. Yet he studied harder than anyone noticed, read books others discarded, and worked jobs that paid little but taught resilience. Racism followed him quietly but persistently. It lived in rejection letters, in job interviews that ended too quickly, in doors that opened just enough to show what lay beyond before closing again. Each obstacle chipped away at him, but each also sharpened his resolve. Years passed. His mother aged faster than she should have. The neighborhood deteriorated further. Many boys he grew up with disappeared into prisons, graves, or lives too heavy to escape. He almost joined them more than once. But somewhere deep inside, that promise remained. It anchored him, reminding him that someone once believed he was worth helping. When he finally left the neighborhood, it was not with certainty but with necessity. He carried little more than determination and memory. The city beyond was larger, colder, and far less forgiving. Yet it also held possibility, if one could endure long enough to reach it. Success did not come quickly, and it did not come kindly. The boy, now a young man, worked jobs that drained his body while sharpening his mind. He cleaned buildings at night and attended classes during the day, surviving on little sleep and less recognition. Every step forward felt earned twice over, once for effort and once for resistance against the assumptions stacked against him. He learned early that intelligence alone was not enough. The world required proof, credentials, and often someone willing to speak for you. He learned how to navigate spaces where he was the only black face, where his presence was questioned without words. Meetings ended with polite smiles that never translated into opportunity. Ideas he presented were ignored until repeated by others. Yet failure taught him strategy. Rejection taught him patience. And struggle taught him discipline. He began to see patterns, understand systems, and exploit gaps others overlooked. He built small successes that slowly grew into something sustainable. Still, the promise lingered. It surfaced during moments of doubt, during nights when exhaustion threatened to undo him. He remembered the warmth of that small shop, the simple act of kindness that had asked nothing in return. It reminded him why he could not quit. As years accumulated, so did his achievements. He launched ventures that catered to underserved communities, recognizing needs others dismissed. He reinvested what little he earned, slowly building something that could withstand loss. Each milestone felt surreal, as if success belonged to someone else. With success came visibility, and with visibility came scrutiny. Mistakes were magnified. Failures were interpreted as confirmation of stereotypes. He learned to be careful, measured, strategic in ways his peers never had to be. He learned how success did not erase racism, but merely changed its shape. 20 years passed almost without announcement. One day he realized that he had become what the world once denied was possible. He had wealth, influence, and a voice that people listened to. Yet the achievement felt incomplete. Something unfinished tugged at him. The memory returned stronger than before. The boy he had been. The promise he had made. The man who had offered dignity when the world had offered none. He wondered if the shop still existed, if the man was still alive, if the promise could still be honored. Doubt crept in. Perhaps the man would not remember. Perhaps returning would reopen wounds best left closed. Perhaps success had already changed him too much. But the promise demanded fulfillment, not for recognition, but for truth. So he returned. The neighborhood had changed, but not for the better. Buildings decayed further. Businesses closed. Hope felt thinner. When his car stopped on a familiar street, curiosity spread quickly. People watched from windows, suspicious of wealth in a place long abandoned by it. The shop was still there, smaller now, more fragile. The sign barely held together. Inside, the man worked slower, older, carrying years in his posture. When the door opened, he barely looked up. Recognition came not immediately, but gradually. A voice, a presence, a memory resurfacing after decades. When realization struck, disbelief followed. The promise once dismissed returned in human form, undeniable and real. The boy had not forgotten. And now, the world would have to reckon with what it meant when someone's society had written off return not broken, but fulfilled. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on both men, though neither spoke. Time collapsed inward, folding decades into seconds. The older man struggled to reconcile the child he remembered with the figures standing before him. The neighborhood, the city, the world had taught him not to expect returns on kindness. Survival had conditioned him to accept loss as permanent. Yet here stood proof that something different had survived. The man listened as the story unfolded, not through dialogue but through shared memory and visible truth. He saw in the visitor the accumulation of struggle, the cost of resilience, and the quiet defiance required to succeed in a world that constantly questioned one's right to exist within it. The visitor explained why he had come, not to boast, not to display success, but to complete a promise that had shaped his life. He spoke of the nights of hunger, the moment of doubt, the invisible hand of that single act of kindness guiding him forward. The older man felt emotion rise, unfamiliar and overwhelming. The promise was kept not with words, but with action. The shop's debts were erased. The building was secured. The neighborhood would no longer be overlooked. Investments were planned not for profit, but for restoration. Jobs would be created. Futures would be built. The impact rippled outward. Those who watched from a distance began to understand. This was not charity. This was justice in its quietest form. A cycle interrupted. A narrative rewritten. The climax was not loud. It was not explosive. It was deeply human. It was the moment when the past met the present and demanded accountability from a world that had laughed at a promise. The neighborhood changed slowly but meaningfully. New businesses opened where abandoned buildings once stood. Children saw possibility reflected back at them instead of limitation. The older man retired not into obscurity but into dignity, knowing that his smallest act had shaped something larger than himself. The boy, now fully a man, continued forward, not untouched by success but grounded by memory. He spoke less about his achievements and more about responsibility. He understood that promises mattered most when no one expected them to be kept. The story spread, not as a myth, but as a reminder. Racism thrives on erasure, on convincing the world that some lives are disposable. This story challenged that lie. It insisted that kindness, when offered without condition, could outlast prejudice, poverty, and time. The promise kept was not just personal. It was collective. It belonged to every child told their dreams were unrealistic, to every person dismissed before they could begin, to every act of kindness offered in a world that rarely rewards it. And so the lesson remained clear. Never underestimate the weight of a promise, especially when it comes from someone the world has already decided does not matter. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Black Voice Story, where powerful stories rise, voices are honored, and truth is never forgotten.